Open the meat case at your grocery store. Beef, pork, chicken, lamb, maybe a tray of turkey. Now, try to remember the last time you saw a horse sitting in there. Not once. Not at the butcher counter, not on a restaurant menu, not in the freezer aisle. And yet, we have lived beside horses longer than almost any other large animal. We bred them, fed them, named them, doctored them, and buried them. We just did not eat them. So why is one large grazing mammal dinner and another one is family? The answer is not a single reason. It is 4 or 5 separate forces, all quietly pointing the same direction. Start with the boring one, money. For most of human history, a live horse was worth far more than a dead one. A horse was a tractor, a truck, and a telephone all at once. It plowed your field, hauled your grain, carried your messages, and if things went badly, carried you away from the fighting. Eating that animal was not a meal. It was liquidating your only major asset. Picture burning your car for firewood on a chilly evening. Technically, it works. Nobody would call it a good trade. Cattle never had that problem. A cow could give milk for years and still become beef at the end. Sheep gave wool first, then mutton. Pigs gave nothing but pork, which is exactly why we ate them without hesitation. The horse was the one animal whose entire value came from staying alive. But economics is only the surface layer. The biology underneath is even less flattering. Horses make terrible livestock. That sounds harsh. It is mostly just arithmetic. A cow is a ruminant. It has a stomach with multiple chambers and a fermentation tank full of microbes that break down grass before real digestion even starts. It pulls calories out of material our bodies cannot touch. A horse ferments too, but in the wrong place. Most of its fermentation happens near the end of the gut, after the best absorption has already passed, which is why horse manure is famously full of undigested seeds and stems. Farmers noticed this. So did the birds. So, a horse eats an enormous amount of grass and gives back comparatively little meat. Then the reproduction math makes it worse. A mare carries a foal for roughly 11 months and almost always delivers one. Sheep often have twins. A single sow can raise a whole litter twice in a year. If you were designing a protein factory from scratch, you would not choose the horse. You would choose almost anything else on the farm. And still, none of that explains the flinch. Inefficiency makes a food rare. It does not make a food forbidden. For that, we have to go to church. In the early 8th century, missionaries pushing into Northern Europe kept running into a problem. The people there ate horse. Not casually, ceremonially. Horse meat sat at the center of sacrificial feasts tied to the old Germanic and Norse gods. The animal was killed, offered, and then shared. Eating it was not just dinner. It was a declaration of who you belonged to. Around the year 732, Pope Gregory III sent instructions to the missionary Boniface, calling the eating of horseflesh unclean and detestable, and telling him to stamp it out. That is the part people find surprising. The ban was never really about health. It was about loyalty. You can see the same logic in Iceland. When the island formally converted to Christianity around the year 1000, its own medieval accounts record that the agreement came with concessions. A few old practices, horse eating among them, were tolerated for a while longer to keep the peace. Those exemptions were quietly dropped later. That is how a food becomes a taboo, not by argument, by association. And once a taboo settles in, something stranger happens. It stops feeling like a rule at all. It starts feeling like instinct. Ask most people in Britain or the United States why they will not eat horse, and they will not cite economics or medieval church letters. They will make a face. That reaction is the fourth force, and it may be the strongest one. We do not eat animals we name. That is not sentimentality. That is a fairly consistent pattern across cultures. Naming an animal moves it from the category of resource into the category of relationship. Horses got names. Horses got personalities. Horses appeared in our stories as heroes and companions, almost never as ingredients. Meanwhile, the pig, which is at least as intelligent, got a number and a pen. So the disgust most of us feel is not a biological signal that horse meat is dangerous. It is a cultural setting we inherited and never opened. Everyone else in the room is running the same original code. But there is one more layer, and this one is modern, legal, and much less romantic. In much of the English-speaking world, horses are simply not raised as food animals. That has a consequence people rarely think about. Food animals are tracked. Every medication given to a cow or a pig is logged against withdrawal periods before slaughter. Horses are not in that system. A pet or a racehorse can receive drugs across its whole life, including common anti-inflammatory medications that are not permitted in animals destined for the food supply. There is often no reliable record following that animal. So even setting aside every cultural argument, the paperwork alone makes horse meat a regulatory headache. In the United States, Congress cut the funding for federal horse slaughter inspection in the mid-2000s, and the last domestic plants shut down shortly after. The practice did not vanish, it moved across the border. And then came the moment that proved how deep the taboo really runs. In 2013, testing across Europe found horse DNA in products labeled and sold as beef. Frozen burgers, ready-made lasagna. Some samples were overwhelmingly horse. Nobody got sick from the horse itself. The scandal was not a poisoning. It was a betrayal. Entire product lines were pulled from shelves across a continent because people had eaten something that was, in most measurable ways, perfectly edible meat. Which brings us to the exceptions, because plenty of the world does eat horse, and those places tell the story better than the ban does. In Kazakhstan and Mongolia, horse meat and fermented mare's milk are ordinary food. That is not a contradiction. On the open steppe, the horse was never a scarce luxury machine. It was the herd itself, kept in numbers alongside sheep and goats. In Japan, raw horse is a regional specialty, especially around Kumamoto, served thin and cold. In parts of northern Italy, horse has long been a local tradition. In Iceland, it never fully disappeared. And France is the clearest case of all. Horse meat sale was legalized there in 1866, pushed partly by reformers who saw cheap protein going to waste. 4 years later, during the siege of Paris, the city ate its horses because there was nothing else. Look closely at every one of those exceptions. The horse was either abundant or the alternative was hunger. That is not a counterexample. That is the rule confirming itself. So, stack it all up. A horse costs more to feed than it returns in meat. It breeds slowly, one foal at a time. It was worth vastly more pulling a plow than filling a pot. Then, early Christian Europe attached a religious prohibition to it, because eating horse marked you as belonging to the old gods. Then, centuries of stories, names, and companionship moved the horse out of the food category entirely. Then, modern drug regulation slammed the door and changed the locks. 5 forces: economics, digestion, history, affection, and paperwork. Not one of them is decisive on its own. Together, they are overwhelming. That is why the answer to why we do not eat horse is never really about taste. Almost nobody who refuses it has ever tried it. Maybe the bigger lesson here is not about horses at all. Most of what we call disgust is just history we stopped questioning. The line between food and family is not written in biology. It is drawn by whoever was useful to us, when, and for how long. Every culture has a horse, some animal that sits just outside the plate for reasons nobody in the room can quite explain. And it always feels like instinct, right up until you look it up. So, open your fridge again. Everything in there passed a test. You just never saw the grading.